Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our talk, American Impact on the Culture of the Republic of Vietnam. I'm Ryan Wolfson-Ford, Southeast Asia Reference Librarian in the library's Asian Reading Room. The talk today considers the impact of the U.S. presence on the culture of the Republic of Vietnam. What were the philosophical and intellectual currents that were relevant and influential at the time? How did South Vietnamese receive and reshape American popular music, movies, fiction, and towards their own purposes? Ultimately, what forms and visions of modernity did non-communist South Vietnamese pursue? The event brings into conversation two scholars of modern Vietnam, Tuan Hoang and Wynn Gadkar-Wilcox, on this important but neglected topic. They seek to flesh out the Vietnamese experiences of decolonization and the Cold War, including their exposure to American culture before and during direct intervention of the U.S. in the Vietnam War. Before we begin our event, I would like to say a few words about the library's Asian Reading Room and also highlight some materials in the Vietnamese collection. The Library of Congress is the largest library in the world with over 170 million items across more than 20 different reading rooms. While its mission is to serve Congress and the American people, more than 50% of the items in the catalog are in languages other than English. The library's mission is to serve as a universal source of knowledge, and so it contains representative works from all societies and cultures. The Asian Reading Room is the main point of access for Asian language texts at the library. It holds 4.4 million physical items, making it one of the largest collections outside of Asia. It has nearly 200 languages and dialects, many from Southeast Asia. And most importantly, the Asian Reading Room is where scholars come to do original research. Come explore the Vietnamese collection at the Asian Reading Room, where you can do serious research or reading for pleasure. You're very welcome to come. The Vietnamese collection itself is 35,000 monographs and serials in Vietnamese language, and there are more titles besides in French and English and other languages. We also have 5,000 maps at the Geography and Map Reading Room and over 500 films in the Moving Image Research Center. And we have more resources such as on-site only databases and thousands of photographs and rare and special collections. So we serve all levels of library users. If you'd like to come but have questions, please feel free to contact me using the Ask a Librarian service. For today's talk, there are two speakers today. Wynn Gadkar-Wilcox is the co-chair and president of history in the Department of History and World Perspectives at Western Connecticut State University. He specializes in the intellectual history, literary history, and historiography of Vietnam from the 18th to the 20th centuries and has secondary interests in cross-cultural relations, world history, religion, and philosophy. He's the author of Allegories of the Vietnamese Past, Unification and the Production of a Modern Historical Identity, and East Asia in the West, and the editor of Vietnam in the West, New Approaches. His new project explores how the Buddhist movement in the Republic of Vietnam in the 1960s was influenced by continental philosophy and in particular existentialism. Tuan Hoang is the Blanche E. Seaver Professor of Humanities and Teacher Education and is Associate Professor of Great Books at Pepperdine University. Dr. Hoang's research is on religious history and the intellectual history in South Vietnam and the Vietnamese diaspora. Among his publications are articles in the Journal of Vietnamese Studies, American Catholic Studies, and U.S. Catholic Historian, and chapters in The Republic of Vietnam, 1955 to 1975, Vietnamese Perspectives on Nation Building, Republic in Vietnam, 1963 to 1975, War, Society, and Diaspora, and the Cambridge History of the Vietnam War. He recently served as guest editor of a special issue of Vietnamese Catholicism for the Journal of Vietnamese Studies. His current research includes a project about Catholics in South Vietnam. So following the talk, we will have a short question and answer period, and for those attending remotely, you may submit your questions in the Q&A box. Please note this session is being recorded and any of your comments or questions will be included as part of the recording. So now let's welcome Tuan and Wynn. Tuan will speak first, followed by Wynn, after which we'll have the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the audience, both those who can make it in person, and I know that there are many more people on Zoom, so thank you for tuning in. I think I will begin with a few remarks, right, and then I will sort of like go through a few slideshows and sort of like talk as if giving a class lecture. So for so I'll begin with something more formal, and basically as you can see from the slide on there, I sort of like add a qualification to the title, right, which is about American cultural impact in South Vietnam. But I also want to emphasize, I definitely want to acknowledge it, but also I like to emphasize, right, how South Vietnamese, non-communist South Vietnamese, right, how they absorb American culture among other cultures, right, and sort of like filtering them, and they were filtering them, they were absorbing them, they were adapting them, so to speak, and into something of their own. So that is sort of like the trajectory of my talk. And I'd like to begin by paying a tribute, if you will. I mean, hopefully you can read the small print on the screen there. But long story short, over 40 years ago, in 1982, the University of Hawaii, the Southeast Asian Studies Center at University of Hawaii, they decided to dedicate an academic year to the study of Vietnam. Interestingly, right, we have to remember, it was 40 years ago. The Vietnam War still cast a very heavy shadow over American society, American politics, and of course, American academia. So it was quite, I think, a fascinating enterprise that, a former South Vietnamese college professor, by the name of by the name of Trung Bulam, in fact, Dr. Gadkar-Wilcox, he has studied him, has studied his work more thoroughly than I have ever done. But he was a South Vietnamese, he was a university professor at University of Saigon, I believe, and then he became a refugee, ended up in Hawaii, right? And he taught at University of Hawaii for the remainder of his academic life. Anyway, he helped to put together this academic gathering. I mean, I'm not quite sure, whether there was an actual conference, but long story short, throughout that year, they, created, he and a bunch of, of friends in Vietnam studies and colleagues in Vietnam studies, they put together this, this short volume, about 9 essays about Vietnam, not the war. Interestingly, right? But about Vietnamese culture. And he decided to use the theme of borrowings and adaptations. So I like to, reference this as a tribute to my academic predecessors in Vietnamese studies, especially right in the early years after the war in the U.S., where there were so many challenges, and yet they were driven right by this desire to study and to understand Vietnamese culture deeply, and so borrowings and adaptations, I think, form the context, if you will, of that book. Well, but I would say that there is more than just a tribute here. The studies of Vietnamese nationalism has long emphasized, right, the patterns of resisting against foreigners, and absolutely, there is no question that it is a very important history. But a bigger story, I would argue, right, is this history of borrowings and adaptations, absorbing, right, foreign influences, external influences, so to speak, the outside influences, and making it into their own, and so it is, I think, not only a bigger story, but, a more interesting story. And so, I like to focus the rest of my talk on one topic, okay, popular music. And so I would just go through, some of the photos in the slides that you can see on the screen here. Elvis Presley, right? I mean, Elvis Presley, there was such a phenomenon, right, is Elvis. And the recent movie, that was widely nominated and won some awards and so on, right, only, I think, illustrate the historical significance of Elvis Presley. Well, let me just say that, yes, Elvis Presley exerted some influence on the popular culture in South Vietnam. As you can see from the, the photo on, up top there, right, you see two young urban students who, one of them at least, dressed up like Elvis Presley, right, and, and posing in a style that is similar to Elvis Presley, okay? Well, but let me qualify by saying that, yes, Elvis Presley was important to certain degrees, right? But there were also many predecessors to Elvis and American popular music as well in South Vietnam. So let me walk, through a few with you here, okay? There was a classical tradition, a tradition of classical music in South Vietnam, not Western classical music, but court music, right? And there was a lot of borrowing from various previous dynasties, the Ming Dynasty, and then the Qing Dynasty, and so on. And that tradition continued well into the 20th century. Well, there were a number of Catholics in Vietnam by the 18th century, by the 17th century even, right? And then down. And so by the early 20th century, Western church music has also made inroads to it. In fact, just this morning, I was in the medicine building, and I had a chance to take a look at this documentary from the late 1950s in South Vietnam, right? And there was a Catholic procession going on, and they were singing Latin, some of the chants and so on. So and that history, goes way back. Okay, so again, an occasion of absorption and adaptation. We have also Western classical music as well, and that is a story that has yet to be written, as far as I know. But of course, right, French, people who occupied and who live in Vietnam, right? They built the Opera House in Hanoi, right, which still stands to this day. They brought musical tradition from Europe in that and they certainly brought it. And I should add also Western drama as well. Indeed, Wynn himself has studied this before, right? How Vietnamese in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, they began to be more interested in Western drama, Molière, for example, and they would begin putting on productions, in Vietnamese as well. Okay, so just to point out, I mean, these are only some of the most prominent and obvious examples about musical adaptation and so on. Well, now I want to focus on two things, and then we move to the era of South Vietnam, right? Something very fascinating, in my opinion, about the first 25 years or 30 years of the 20th century in Vietnam is that there were not just one or two, but many things going on musically speaking. To simplify it a little bit, there was reforms, in the traditional music of Vietnam, right? And so it led to categories such as cải lương, reform music, reform drama, or which was very, very strong, especially in southern Vietnam. But people in northern Vietnam also listened to it and produced them too. And then some other traditions that were more prominent in northern Vietnam. But at the same time, right, Western music as I mentioned before, right, was also making inroads, and thanks partially, not only to people who actually play, this music, band music, for example, people who play, right, violins and pianos and, and trumpets and so on. There were not just Vietnamese, but also Indians in Tonkin who were actually sometimes hired by, by French authorities or by Vietnamese to perform in music. So the phonographs also makes a massive influence, right? Because now people can actually listen. You can see like from one of the photos on the screen there, right? That is taken, it's a still from the French movie Indochine, in which scene, right, the character played by Catherine Deneuve, she is dancing, with her adopted Vietnamese daughter, right, to a record, being played in their house at the time, just to illustrate, right, the growth, if you will, of Western music among the middle class, especially, and the upper class as well. Okay, so that leads us to, a later period, and there's a lot here. So within my, the confinement of my time, let me just begin by going through a few things, and then hopefully, in case you have any questions, hopefully I can answer them later on during the Q&A. Well, I would conceptualize, if you will, South Vietnam, right, in the context of what had gone before, in the broader context of borrowing and adaptations, right, in the large context of different influences, okay, Chinese, right, Japanese, French, obviously, Catholic Church music, Latin-based and so on, and then ultimately American as well. So I want to contextualize Americans' influence, in this case on popular music in South Vietnam, right, in the broader context of other influences, right, and also the context of how the Vietnamese received them and turned them into, each one into, their own things. I would conceptualize this, overarching scene as a marketplace, if you will, of popular music. So there is not just one or two or even three, right? There were multiple types of music that were, competing, so to speak, for attention, depending on the which group you're talking about, age-wise, right, gender-wise, class-wise, and so on and so forth. The Cải Lương I mentioned earlier, right, it was very popular among well, Southerners, yes, but but even some of the Northerners who migrated south after 1954, right, they would get interested in Cải Lương. And indeed, the two middle photos on the screen, they are both Cải Lương productions in South Vietnam. I think both are from the 1960s, and they tend to be very sentimental, right? Family drama, so to speak, social issues sometimes, but done, right, in both spoken form and then, sung form as well, according, with older type of instrument. My friend Jason Gibbs has studied the development of Vietnamese bolero. Jason is, and there is, I think, a lot that needs to look into, and hopefully he will put his, findings into more publications for our benefit. But I do understand, right, that the bolero music in Vietnam, right, which is, a mix of like Cuban and Filipino, and Western music, right? And yet the Vietnamese, over time, they turned this rumba form of music into something that is, distinctly, maybe, or semi-distinctly Vietnamese. Indeed, if you are in, if you have been to Vietnam in the last 10 years or 8 years, right, you may notice that bolero has made a comeback in Vietnam now. It never went away, really, but certainly I think a lot more, we see a lot more live performances, and then thanks to YouTube, a lot of recordings of young, Vietnamese, usually women, but also young men, who sing these old songs of bolero. That was most of them were written really, during the period of the Republic of Vietnam, mostly in the 60s and the early 70s. Okay, so there is a lot of that was going on in South Vietnam as well, right? And there is no American influence as far as I can tell in this context. Okay. And then there was all the type of Vietnamese pop music as well, right? Songwriters like Trần Công Sơn and Phạm Duy, right? They wrote a lot of romantic songs, for example, along with nationalist songs and anti-war songs and things like that. So that's another category that can easily, I can easily spend an hour talking about. But let me get more to the Americans now, right? Youth music. Youth music, right? Like the photos that the bottom two photos from the screen there. One of them actually, the color photo, on the bottom there. Actually, that is actually not a Vietnamese band. It was actually a Filipino band. Okay, and I want to point out this interesting things that that we, I think, just begun to think about and discover more, and hopefully music historians can find out more, right? Well, Filipinos, for a mix of background and so on, right? They were very active musicians during the Cold War era, and even before. They were traveling, all over East and Southeast Asia. Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, and certainly South Vietnam. And they perform, and we don't really have a lot of records, from photography and so on yet. And so it may take some time to hopefully to find, but we do know, right, that they were traveling around and they were performing. They were performing in Saigon for sure. They were performing in Chinatown, in Jalen, actually quite a bit. And in this case, they were actually, this particular band, they were performing in front of American soldiers. Okay. So a fascinating thing is going on here, right? We all know about Bob Hope, right, and American entertainers, right, going to South Vietnam, right, to entertain American troops throughout the 60s and the early 70s. We know that. But we got to remember, too, that other people, non-Americans, were also performing, in front of American troops and, usually in bases, sometimes, in bars and so on, obviously, where a lot of Americans, would patronize, but even in military bases and such as this photo. Okay. And later on, Vietnamese themselves began to form bands and perform. They tried to get gigs in these bases. Okay. So that is, there is a lot there that we have yet to know enough, right? But we do know that it happened. In fact, this is a while ago, maybe 7-8 years ago, I did have a chance to sit down and have a talk with, one of the young, then young musician and performer in South Vietnam. He did some recording, but he told me about how, right, his band got gigs to perform in military bases and things like that, right? And because for him and his friends, right, these are economic opportunities, but also artistic opportunities. Something, right, that was not quite popular yet, and yet they were driven, these young men, and they were all, high school and college, university students. They really looked for opportunities to perform in front of people, be they Americans or Vietnamese or what have you. Okay, and so one of the photo, the second photo on the bottom, right, shows one of those youthful band. Okay. Well, the thing is that and also there's a whole chapter, if you will, about how music. Pop music, in all forms, both the more traditional form, like the bolero music, maybe to a lesser degree, but certainly the non-bolero pop music, right, and also youth music, right, became more and more mainstream precisely because of radio and television. Okay. And then, okay, a couple of photos here about the American impact. As I mentioned, right, Americans certainly performed right, for American military personnel and such. But also Vietnamese themselves, but later on would participate. Okay. By the way, the second photo, of a women's band, I think there are 2 women in that band. They are also Filipino. Actually, that's not Vietnamese. I had a harder time finding photos of Vietnamese performing, but I know that they were there. So hopefully more will pop up, not only in archives but also I think in online and so on, because I think a lot of people have them, but they just haven't. And so indeed among the audience, if you have them, please, put them online so that we know more about them, okay? There's no question that Elvis Presley and other, right, American music, especially easy listening, as well as like soft pop, became more known in South Vietnam during this era and so on, okay? But again, like I said before, maybe the more interesting story is how the Vietnamese absorbed them. So that brings me to my conclusion here. Just a few more photos here of young men and young women. And by the way, the photo of the woman holding the acoustic guitar, that's the same person. But I want to show them because you notice, right, that she is wearing a different type of dress, each one, right? So showing that she is both Vietnamese and also Western, so to speak, okay? Okay, all right, a few conclusions. There is no question, in my opinion, that American impact on the popular music in South Vietnam was real and substantial. In fact, we need to study more of it. There is a lot that we don't quite know yet, okay? But from memoirs of Vietnamese, some of whom are no longer with us, right? We do know that they encounter Americans in different ways. Sometimes in the air bases, sometimes in, military bases, right? But sometimes on the street, on the marketplace, in recording, studios and things like that. And young urban South Vietnamese tended to be the, biggest audience, right, of American music. But once again, for the last time, I do want to contextualize, right, the broader Vietnamese experience when we talk about American impact on Vietnamese popular music here. There is, I would say, a new youth culture being created during the 60s and the early 70s and the mid and so on. And I would argue this. What we are seeing about this period, right, is that they were both nationalistic, yes, no question about that, right? I mean, but also there was a growing, if you will, perception of individualism, okay? And by individualism, I don't mean, the way we think of individualism now, right? Actually, a lot of Vietnamese, including young people, were very wary, right, of individualism, because for them that is selfish. That is just too much hyper-individualism, right? You can do whatever you like. No. That is not the type of... But it was a moderate form, perhaps, of individualism. And I think, the intersection of in this case, right, American music, right, and South Vietnamese, right, contributed to that growing one. And then, right, they were nationalistic. They considered themselves Vietnamese, with its own... with various definitions, right? But also global. I think absorption in this case, right? Not only they welcome it, but I think they welcome it with a particular meaning as well. That that they also can become global. And so just to go back to the previous slideshow, right? Look at the photo of Thanh Lan, by the way, of extremely popular, singer in South Vietnam, and she sang a lot of genres, by the way, except for Cải Lương, but like in terms of popular music in non-traditional one, she sang all types of music, and so she was very, very popular. And I think, right? You look at the black and white photo of her, you see, so to speak, or at least for her, I think, is the national. She sees her Vietnamese identity to it, right? But she is also wearing, right, a dress, maybe a skirt, I'm not quite sure. And she did that a lot, right, as a student, as a young woman, to articulate, right, a form of global participation in modernity. All right. So with that, I will pause. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Wynn.
Thank you, Tuan. My mother, who is somewhere out on the web right now, thanks you for the shout out to Elvis, whom she has loved since she was 12. So that's good. And later on, I'm going to ask you a question about the Carpenters. But thank you very much for that. My presentation, and we organized this as loosely as possible, but it all worked out somehow, is going to focus not so much on musical aspects of culture, but primarily on American influence on universities and on literature. This is a typical scene one might find. This is a 1969 picture of several of the famous bookstores that one might find in Saigon in 1969. And if you were to wander into one of those, what would you find? Well, first of all, you would find shelves upon shelves of American literature in Vietnamese translation. The farther you got into the early 1970s, the more such books you would find. You'd find journals and newspapers, which proliferated during the Republic of Vietnam. And those journals and newspapers you would flip through would most likely contain analyses or translations from the likes of John Steinbeck or J.D. Salinger or O. Henry. And you would also hear out on the street, as Tuan has mentioned, American music, but also Vietnamese music, clearly influenced by American rock and roll or American folk, or even to a certain extent, American jazz. So how did this come about? Well, the obvious answer to this would be that there was a massive military presence of the United States in Vietnam at this time. But that really is only a small part of the answer. So a lot of American cultural influence in Vietnam was essentially indigenous, with some caveats. And two areas that I think require further study are the following. First of all, American cultural influence was facilitated through cultural and student exchanges. American academics or students coming to the Republic of Vietnam on the one hand, and students and or professors from the Republic of Vietnam coming to the United States. And was also influenced by the importance of certain nonprofit groups, the Asia Foundation, the Ford Foundation among them, as well as actual United States government activity, and not only in facilitating these exchanges, but also in producing books for the libraries of those universities, in producing and funding translations, and producing scholarship on American literature and culture. This story has essentially three phases. It doesn't line up exactly with the standard periodization, but we don't have much time, so I've put it in that way. During the First Republic period, 1955 to 1963, you have fairly heavy American influence on the structure and content of universities in the Republic of Vietnam. But a somewhat lesser presence of American authors and themes in literature. There were, of course, translations and studies of American literature at the time, but they tended, in general, to be published if they fit into pre-existing Vietnamese interests in literature, particularly if they fit into an interest in French as extensualism. In the interregnum period, 1963 to 1967, U.S. influence on universities and universities themselves tended to wane a little bit, especially the University of Hue, but really all universities were hit by the events of 1963 and lost both enrollment and support for a time. And then they were hit again in 1968 by Tet, especially, again, the University of Hue. But they had already developed this capacity and this curriculum in the First Republic period. On the other hand, in literature and culture, there was an exponentially increasing interest in American literature and culture, which by the Second Republic period had reached a virtual explosion, leading to fears among some intellectuals that the overwhelming influence of American culture would be harmful to Vietnamese culture, and that the overwhelming influence of translations would lead to people not reading Vietnamese literature itself as much, and led therefore to a movement to temper the influence of Americans and others with returning to an Asian spirit, an idea, ironically, they got primarily not from Vietnamese sources, but from Indian ones. All right, that's basically the talk in a nutshell. So if I run out of time, I've already said what I wanted to say. So that's convenient. There are some antecedents, of course, to American cultural relations with Vietnam. Many of you may have heard about the effort by Thomas Jefferson to import rice from southern Vietnam. While ambassador to France, he wrote a letter to the South Carolina planter William Henry Drayton, mentioning that via Pierre Poivre he had become acquainted with the Crown Prince of the Nguyen, who was in Paris at this time, along with Jefferson. So he wrote a letter suggesting that Vietnamese rice was very good and it would grow very nicely in the American South, which probably would have been the case. Jefferson was a great horticulturalist, but it seems that nothing came of it. That may be a brief but happy encounter. A somewhat less happy encounter is the story, the 1856 story of Mad Jack Percival, the admiral of the U.S. Navy in charge of the USS Constitution, which still sits today in Boston Harbor. Well, back at that time, Percival had the good idea, or he thought it was good, that he was going to save an important French missionary who had been imprisoned by the regime, and so he stormed into Da Nang Harbor and kidnapped 3 Vietnamese officials. Eventually having to sail away, not having accomplished his goal, although the missionary Dominique Lefebvre was eventually released. But this, of course, is not an encounter that has to do specifically with Vietnamese literature. For that, we'll have to wait for the most part, although there are some references in the late 19th and early 20th century, but they really explode with the explosion of vernacular publication in Vietnam in the 1920s and 1930s. The person most associated with publications of this kind is Ngo Duk Kaye, who published a series for young people called, Eastern and Western Heroes, something like that. And the first volume was dedicated to George Washington, with an appendix on Horatio Nelson, which seems like odd bedfellows, except what a better way to stick it to the French than to lionize Horatio Nelson. I think that may be the reason why he was chosen. But he went on in this series to also write about Benjamin Franklin and about Lincoln. And that actually started a Vietnamese fascination with Lincoln that continued through the 1930s in various ways. There was also, by the late 1930s and early 1940s, an influence from the United States that came in cinema. Many years ago, the famous Vietnamese filmmaker Chen Van Thuy told me that one of his major influences as a kid was how much he liked to go to the movies in Hanoi and watch John Wayne, which seemed to be incongruous since Chen Van Thuy is a demure. It doesn't strike me as a John Wayne type, but anyway, in his book, he also recounts the importance of his idolization of figures like Marlene Dietrich, and is remembering going in particular to see Gone with the Wind as a young person in Hanoi in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So that influence was already there, but it's at a very different level than we see in the Republic of Vietnam. And the first reason for that is the technical assistance that was provided to Vietnamese universities at the time. So the University of Saigon existed as a branch campus prior to 1954. In 1954, most of the faculty and students of the University of Hanoi traveled to the south to avoid communist control in the north. And so the University of Saigon tripled in size virtually overnight and needed to create capacity to make that happen. One way that this was created was through a partnership with Michigan State University, and many of you may know about. Professor Wesley Fischel, who you see on the right-hand side here, had met the President of the Republic, Ngo Dinh-Diem, in Japan in 1951, and the two of them had established a kind of alliance. The longtime president of Michigan State University, John Hanna, who's over on the left of your screen, was in support of this alliance and gave Michigan State as a place that Vietnamese could study, and also sent graduate students and professors to the University of Saigon to help build that capacity. I put just one of them up here, Father Robert Crawford, one of the most interesting of these figures, who eventually helped a number of Vietnamese escape in 1975, and out of desperation ended up housing them in a beer hall in Oregon. But that story is for another time. Also, this technical capacity was produced by the Asia Foundation, a nonprofit foundation formed in 1954, which did help in these exchanges, giving scholarships for travel for Vietnamese students, and also helping facilitate American professors coming to Vietnam. They also helped in writing curriculum. For example, they employed Professor Reed Tunningham of the psychology department at UC Berkeley to write the curriculum for the psychology departments, and this was very frequently done. And then they would stock the libraries with books that they had received from the United States. And so that meant that what was studied at these universities, particularly in this period in Hue and Saigon, what was studied at these universities were books that came from the United States and also curricula from the United States. There were, of course, also Vietnamese intellectuals who came to America. They were oftentimes supported by a group called the American Friends of Vietnam, which was headed by Joseph Buttinger, seen here on the left. On the right is a picture of Nguyen Hoa, who studied at New York University from 1950 to 56, and went on to be a professor of note at the University of Saigon before moving near the end of the war back to the United States. And there were travelogues that students kept of their time in the United States, which then entered Vietnamese journals. One such student wrote the journal Bakwa Encyclopedia in an aerogram with tiny, tiny, tiny print. You see the aerogram here about her experiences as a student at Michigan State University. She was bewildered most by the dating culture in Lansing, which she said convinced her that Kipling and Pearl Buck were really right, that east is east and west was west and never the twain would meet. I'm not sure what she would think about dating culture in Lansing in 2023. But in any case, also, of course, on the right, you see Thich Nhat Hanh, who wrote a diary of his experiences while a student at Princeton Theological Seminary, and also while taking classes at Columbia, which was later translated into English. And so these kinds of travelogues, travel writing, then entered in the literature. In the mid-1960s, this kind of aid fractured. One reason was it became clear that the Asia Foundation was funded primarily by the CIA, This led to, even before it was announced, there was some reduction in the faith of nonprofit efforts like this because of suspicions in this regard, that they were disfavoring what they felt to be people with connections to sort of leftist parts of the Buddhist movement. But this was only one problem. The American Friends of Vietnam fractured over whether to support Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963. And although they continued until 1975, this impacted their funding structure. But the American influence that had been created during the First Republic was already in place. I'll just say a few things about literature and then I'll wrap up. American cultural influence on Vietnamese literature in the late 50s and early 60s existed, but was on a more limited level. And during this period, Vietnamese writers and scholars were fascinated by French existentialism. There were debates about whether Camus or Sartre or Meunier or Maurice Nesondel was the greatest exemplar of the tradition of French existentialism. And they were interested in American writers primarily to the extent that they could fit in with this tradition. So J.D. Salinger, arguably the most sort of existentialist, not J.D. Salinger. This is why we don't go into what William Faulkner, perhaps the person most influenced by French existentialism, was the one who was most translated at this time. You see Faulkner up there on the right. Short stories, but also longer pieces were included at this time. There were also writings on others at this time, particularly from the polyglot and prolific author Wynn, who Tuan has studied, who translated various texts such as The Habits of Highly Effective People by Dale Carnegie, and also had analyses of the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe. But this was more sporadic. By the mid-1960s, we see an exponential increase in the amount of translations and analyses of Americans and Vietnamese writing. The pivotal year for this really was 1965. The journal Wynn, which was one of the journals that most translated foreign works, went from having an occasional special issue on American writers to having 3 special issues in just that one year. A special issue on Steinbeck, a special issue on Erskine Caldwell, and a special issue on Tennessee Williams. And we see after that, when we get into the Second Republic, that it only expands. And so we find in Wynn the influence of ever more obscure figures like Carson McCullers being translated. And we have sort of a massive interest in translating books like The Godfather, which you see here, and an increasing interest in American cultural figures like Martin Luther King. This led, by the early 70s, to a concern that American culture was overly widespread. This was particularly of concern due to the growth of hippie movements within South Vietnam, which some Vietnamese politicians regarded as overly indulgent, self-indulgent, and individualistic, and therefore against Vietnamese culture. There were also concerns that the level of translations would crowd out Vietnamese authors from working, but these concerns were also met with humor and skepticism by some other authors. There was an attempt at this time to balance this out by focusing on indigenous authors and on Asian spirituality as opposed to Western materialism. But this did very, very little to limit the scope of Vietnamese, of U.S. cultural influence on Vietnam. Some of this cultural influence was surely not politically neutral. The U.S. Information Agency was responsible, for example, for thousands of copies of works promoting American culture. This short book on Martin Luther King was actually produced by them, with help from American psychological operations. But it was also a genuine influence that was part of a modernist vision of how Vietnamese people could put together the best of Western civilization with Vietnamese culture to create something unique for themselves. Thank you.
I guess we can take questions. If anybody has any in the audience or from Zoom.
Yeah, thank you both for your interesting talks. I have one question for both of you. You, of course, both of your talks covered the period until 1975. 1975 is the end of the Vietnam War. So, so the influence of American culture then stopped in 1975. After 1975, the victors started to erase the memory of South Vietnam, and including also books and music, yellow music, and so on and so on. But I mean, in the long-term perspective, did American culture have a long-term influence on Vietnam? I mean, after also the turning point, 1975. So, and one question for you, Tuan. You mentioned this term bolero music, and I was wondering, since when has this term been used in Vietnam? Because my impression is, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right, that in the last few years in present-day Vietnam, this term is increasingly used instead of this term yellow music. And so these days in Vietnam, you can see all these music shows, music programs. It's all yellow music, and that music used to be banned for, 30 years? And they just say it's bolero music, and it's very romantic, and it's wonderful music, right?
Yeah, no, that is a great question, right? Like, in a sense, the more things change, the more, right, they remain. Well, that is a bit of a different history, I think, the post-war history, right? Like you said, after the war, the government, right, banned, yellow music, among many other things, books, magazines as well, for a long, long time. And so what happened is that bolero music was kept alive in the diaspora. These musical show, right? Tuan and Asia and so on. They kept producing them. They would feature prominent songwriters of that genre, right? And singers, right, who made their fame in South Vietnam, as well as new younger singers, right? And so I'm not quite sure at this point, right, about how it returned, so to speak, to Vietnam. Well, one thing I do know is that a number of diasporic performers, they went back to Vietnam to perform. So once again, in person matter a great deal. It's not just recording and videotapes and things like that. So that Trans-Pacific, I think, movement did help. As for the question, I know you didn't exactly ask it, right? But like, why is it? Why did Vietnamese pick it up again? It is a more difficult question to ask. My own sense is, again, to go back, right, to my conceptualization of South Vietnam, but maybe post-war Vietnam as well, right? Vietnam today, it's kind of like a marketplace, of different influences, right? I mean, if you asked young people in Vietnam today, I imagine that the majority of them would like would say K-pop would be, their biggest form of music. But at the same time, I think there is a sizable, number of young people and not so young people, right, who like bolero music. And again, they utilize, right, means in this case YouTube specifically, but also television programs and so on to do that. So.
Just a quick comment about this. I have only anecdotes, but I was going to say to Tuan that one thing I remember about going to the South in 1998 is that I knew I was in the South when all of a sudden the Carpenters became ubiquitous. And that's not the case anymore, but I would think that that has to be some sort of holdover. I remember going to the house of a friend's relative and having them go down to a basement and open a big case in which was stored all of these books from the Republic period that they had sort of shunted away in 1975. I'll bet, although I don't know for sure, that was a common occurrence. And so there is some continuity. Obviously, by the time you get to the 90s, there is American influence. I remember in 1998, Titanic was everywhere. Titanic socks, Titanic underwear, Titanic flip-flops, and all of this. So, but I think there is at least some continuity remaining, even if there were efforts at repression.
Speaking of the Carpenters, I remember reading some history books, right, that in the 70s and 80s, a number of American critics, were puzzled of their popularity, right? I mean, like all these mid-tempo tunes, right? Like sentimental, soft, music, right, in an era of like rock and roll and disco and so on. How could the Carpenters were so popular in spite of all that? Well, I would say that for the South Vietnamese, they were popular exactly because they provided a perfect venue for many South Vietnamese to sing them. Right? Exactly because the songs were mid-tempo. That they were perfect. There was no karaoke yet, right? But if there was, I mean, like they would be even more, I think, popular for that reason. So I would say a mix of soft rock and easy listening, what we could call easy listening today, right? And I like the photo you show of the translation of The Godfather. Well, the theme song to The Godfather was a big hit in South Vietnam as well, precisely because of the sentimentality, the soft tempo, the love, aspect, the tragic love aspect, and all that stuff just play right into, I think the perception of modernism, so to speak, of these young people.
Thank you for your talks. I thought they were fascinating. I have a question for both of you. Well, the first one for Wynn. I'm really curious about the 1920s, 30s Vietnamese writings about American heroes like George Washington, Franklin, and so on. Can you say, did the writers of these have a political agenda? What was their aim? Were they trying to tell Vietnamese people to follow their example? What were they trying to do?
Yes. Well, for one thing, Ngo Duk Kae's grandson is Ngo Duk Ta, who is a very well-known scholar, Han scholar, and he's written a biography of his grandfather, and I'm sure would be happy to answer these kinds of questions. He is fairly readily available. Or you can ask him about 17th century Norman orthography, whatever you prefer. He was, Ngo Duk Kae got his Tien Si in 1901, which is the same year that Phan Chi Chin took the exam. He was imprisoned by the French after the events of 1907 to 1908, originally sentenced to death, although that was eventually commuted, and he served a long prison sentence. And so he comes from that generation, and that's definitely his intention here. Mark Bradley says that some of these books were on French censorship lists. I haven't been able to confirm that. But definitely the idea here, I mean, like, for example, the Lincoln book, the focus is on the idea that, it's rather romanticized, but the idea that American culture stands for freedom and that Lincoln stood for freedom because Lincoln freed the slaves, and that these, the implication being obvious that this is a model then that Vietnamese need to follow.
And if I may just add to that, right? Yeah, no question, there is a high nationalist sentiment or sentiments, attached to many of these translations and stories. And at the same time, I think there was also an elevation of heroism, like individualism as well in more acceptable forms, if you will. And we need to remember too, right, that at this time, these translations were done in Japanese, in Chinese, as well, and a lot of Chinese urban educated people were reading them as well, except that they weren't Chinese. So it was not just exclusive to Vietnam, but the Vietnamese certainly seized upon them, right, to promote their own agenda, right, of an independent nation, and then also, right, and also we need like talented, hardworking people, individuals, to build this nation as well.
I imagine that in South Vietnam, maybe the governments didn't really want leftists or anti-war music to get in there. Was there an amount of control or censorship? Were people trying to get around that, to get rid of the more political leftist songs, or yeah?
No, certainly. A number of Trinh Công Sơn songs, right, were definitely censored, or he encountered, governmental interference and things like that. I mean, most of them were eventually, recorded and distributed and listened widely. But there was definitely, a lot of governmental eye watching, on the activities, and it's a long, complicated topic to get into, but there's no question that there was censorship. Yes.
There's one more question. Oh, okay, that's fine.
We're out of time for today. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to more events from the Asian Reading Room, and please come use the Vietnamese collection. So thank you for having Tuan Hoang and Wynn Gadkar-Wilcox here for this talk. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Ray.